Hello, Dobry день. Welcome everyone to the Electronic Records Management Workshop. This workshop is organized jointly by the Ukraine-Canadian Congress National Archives Committee and the Sustainable Ukrainian-Canadian Heritage Program, or such for short, of the Cool Folklore Center at the University of Alberta. We are connecting today from Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory and homeland of many Indigenous peoples. I'm Marina Chernявska. I work as an archivist at the Cool Folklore Center and coordinate the Such program. And I'm also a co-chair of the UCC Archives Committee. Our joint goal is to raise awareness about the importance of preserving the Ukrainian-Canadian cultural heritage created by individuals, families, and organizations over the past 100+ years, and those that are being created today. You can learn more about the Archives Committee and Such network at the link that I'm going to paste in the chat. I would like to acknowledge other members of the UCC Archives Committee, my co-chair Andriy Savchuk, and other members, some of whom are going to be present here today: Irene Jinjovsky, Bogdan Figol, Andriy Chernevich, Andriy Paranchuk, and last but not least, our newest member and instructor of today's workshop, Olena. It is my pleasure to introduce Olena. Olena has been involved in the Ukraine-Canadian community in various capacities, serving on the UCC Board of Directors, SUSC Executive Committee, UCPBA Toronto Board, and Edmonton Ukrainian Festival Society Board. She has a Master of Information Studies from University of Toronto, focusing on library and information sciences and knowledge and information management. Olena has experience working with physical and electronic records in libraries, government, and is now working as a consultant with KPMG. She has led imaging and digitization projects with the government of Alberta and supported the development of their digitization standard. And on this, I will pass it over to Olena.
Thank you, Marina. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll get started. We can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, well, welcome everyone. Before we get started, I'm going to say that today's session is going to be recorded, so it will be made available online. All attendees' microphones will be muted as much as possible. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat, as well as if you require any kind of technical help, please put it in the chat and we'll try to respond to you as soon as possible. And the presentation that I'm going over today will be sent to all of you after the event. So, our objectives today. So this is an introduction to electronic records management. It's not necessarily going to be meant for professionals that are in the information or records management realm. However, hopefully I can give you some tools to go over today. So at the end of the session today, you should be able to describe the drivers for improving your organization's record keeping. You should be able to identify key terminology relating to record keeping and information management. You'll understand some basic principles and concepts associated with record keeping. And then I'll also be providing you with some tools and resources that you can take away and use with your organizations. So how are we going to get this done today? So I'm going to try to have this done in less than an hour. We will see. But we're going to go over an introduction to electronic records management. Then we're going to go over some terminology. Again, we're looking at concepts. And then finally, with some supporting tools and resources. And then we'll do a session recap for with all key takeaways. So let's begin by introducing electronic records management as a concept and describing some of the key drivers associated with electronic records management today. So ISO 15489 is an international standard about records management, and it gives us a rather long definition about records management. But it is defined as the field of management responsible for the efficient and systematic control of the creation, receipt, maintenance, use, and disposition of records, including processes for capturing and maintaining evidence of an information and information about business activities and transactions in the form of records. So it's quite a long, lengthy definition, but essentially we're saying records management is one of management's responsibilities, but it's not merely an administrative process, which is looked after just by junior staff or secretaries, for example. Management also includes senior management, and they have a duty to ensure effective management of an organization's records. So it's really everybody's job here. Now, the use of words like creation, receipt, use, disposition, it shows us that records management addresses the entire life cycle of records. It's not just about storing dead or archived or unused records. Rather, it concerns records from the very creation. And we're maintaining them throughout their use until they're no longer needed. While a critical part of records management is storing records to make sure they remain accessible, it is equally important that records are disposed of as soon as they are no longer needed. In a half-joking way, we can think of records management as the art of throwing things away. It includes techniques to allow records managers to know what to throw away and what to keep. Finally, the concept of maintaining evidence serves to remind us that records may be needed as evidence, whether it may be in response to a litigation, income taxes. It proves a transaction to auditors or legal administration, and it essentially reinforces the idea that records need to be kept securely and make sure that it is secured against any charge or against unauthorized deletion. So we need to make sure records are a credible source of evidence. So next we'll look at the 4 business drivers that are giving so much momentum to electronic and records management. And you can see these 4 main drivers are compliance, effectiveness, efficiency, and continuity. These combined in different proportions to make a business case or a good case for electronic records management in most organizations. So the next four slides, I'm going to look at these one at a time. So the main business driver for electronic records management over the past few years has been compliance. It can be a vague and all-encompassing term in different settings, but different organizations have different types of requirements that they need to comply with. So this could be legal compliance pieces, regulations, policies, standards, as well as good practices. So laws are, and also there's, within the compliance realm, there's different severities of these different issues. So laws are very different from good practices. So keep that in mind in terms of what we're adhering to in terms of electronic records management. The next driver is effectiveness. By effectiveness, we mean doing things better. That is doing things in a way which is more sensible for the business or organization, but not necessarily saving money. Better effectiveness can be improving your organization's processes, improving your organization's reputation. And some examples of effectiveness that we'll see is like not losing your records once they're stored, being able to find them efficiently. We want to talk about sharing records. Does your current environment allow for many users or many people to read these records once they need them? Can you find them easily? And can you get the complete picture of everything you need? And has it been correctly filed so you can get that full picture? And because of this, you'll be able to have, there's some great outcomes that can come with that. So you have some higher evidential weight. You can actually demonstrate the consistency of your records. You can retrieve them faster. They might be available more readily. And also, it also includes disaster recovery and backups. So if any of your records have been ever damaged by floods, or your computer gets in the electronic realm, if your computer just shuts down, are you able to retrieve these records if a disaster occurs? So that's what this slide is describing here. Also, the third driver here is efficiency. And this we mean reducing costs. It could be saving money, but note that we are placing this driver after effectiveness. That is because most often the implementation of an electronic records management environment is not just justified or driven by cost savings alone. So benefits for electronic records management efficiencies are accessing records quickly. All the records are stored within one system ideally and can be accessible within seconds. Organizing your electronic records in a consistent manner can also increase your space savings. So this usually happens, we can be filling up cabinets or set up a space aside for archives. The effect is highly dependent on individual organizational circumstances, but electronic records management can really help benefit organizations by saving space. And finally, another benefit is reducing the document handling costs. So often if we can file our records more efficiently, there's not as much time in searching for your records, sending them to someone, retrieving them, refiling them. So this can also be a possible driver for electronic records management. And the final driver is business continuity. So being able to recover records after a disaster. So we are all aware there are all sorts of disasters that can affect an organization. So like natural disasters, as well as cyber threats. So this is something to keep in mind. And this is relevant for electronic records management because organizations can tend to lose their records, especially, and if you do lose your records, then your organization might be at threat of not having the full picture or ultimately not surviving in some cases. So we want to make sure that we're able to have that knowledge continuity and I guess organizational culture and institutional knowledge maintained, and often records do support that. So now let us look at the importance of records management today and in particular electronic records management. So first, virtually all newly created records are created electronically today. They are what we call born digital. Whether a record is in a format of a letter, email, fax, or any other transaction, chances are it was originally created with a computer. So this situation has crept up on us relatively fast and unnoticed by some organizations in records management terms, at least. Other factors which have caused electronic records management to increase is an increased importance in the growth and awareness of how record keeping, how important records can be. This has come as a direct result of high-profile governance failures in both the commercial world and public sector. There are numerous corporate failures and possibly less visible but highly embarrassing failures in government has shone a spotlight on the need for good record keeping. And that means keeping electronic records, as just explained. The inevitable result has been an increase in government laws and regulations, and that require organizations to keep and manage their records better. And here I just included a screenshot for you to help you understand how quickly electronic records can be accumulated. So I've given you a screenshot of my own personal files for work, as well as my emails in the last 6 months. So I have over 4,000 emails accumulated already, and I have over 300 files saved in my own personal work account in the last 6 months. These are just my personal ones. I can only imagine what organizations have for decades of records. So keep that in mind, that the growth of electronic records can actually grow quite exponentially. So before I move on to our next section, I would just want to check in and see how we're doing. Any questions, concerns, anything that needs clarity?
And a note to all participants, you're welcome to either type your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak up. It seems like we're okay for now.
Excellent. So far, so good. Okay. So now let's look at some important terms in the field of electronic records management. So many of the definitions and ideas in this session I'm taking from key references. So I'm referring to the International Standard on Records Management, so ISO 15489. I'm also going to be taking some other pieces or other resources into account here. So there's a resource called MOREC2, as well as the European Commission of Model requirements for management of electronic records, as well as I guess a policy instrument from the US as well, as I like some other definitions. So we're going to keep moving forward here. So what is a record? So now we move on to the definition of records and the concept of the record's life cycle. Obviously, understanding what a record is must be crucial to electronic records management. But curiously, this term does not always translate well, and the very concept of a record here is not always clear as we go from different organization to different organization. That said, the idea of a record is often concerned about a corporate or institutional memory. It's related to archives and is linked to proving what happened or how things were done. In truth, records are more than this, but the definition of a record will be slightly different for each organization. Organizations often have to determine the definition themselves and determine how they want to manage the records appropriately. But in the interim, let's look at the ISO definition. So information created, received, and maintained as evidence and information by an organization or person in a pursuance of legal obligations or in the transaction of business. The first point to note is the word information. Note this word is not document. It is not a paper document. It's not necessarily records. It's information. And this is because a record could, in principle, be any form or format we think of, as long as it conveys information. This means that electronic, paper, or other physical records are also included, like audio, video, instant messages. Those could all be considered records. Keeping a record as information merely means that you have to be able to access it whenever you need it. So usually to help someone in organizing in an organization to make a decision or for evidential purposes. Now, I'm also going to give you two definitions of a document. The first one here is record. A document is a recorded information or object which can be treated as a unit. And the second one here is an information set down in any physical form or characteristic. A document may or may not meet the definition of a record. So how do you make sense of what a document is and what a record is? So you can think of the distinction between documents and records this way. Some documents become records at the time in their existence, others don't. So here's what happens when a document does become a record. A document by definition is not necessarily controlled. That means that it can be changed, can be changed by individuals, so it could be considered unlocked. At some point, when it does become a record, it is protected and locked in. At that point, there's going to be some context around it that related to whether it's going to be a classification item or the filing structure or metadata. We'll get there. Don't worry if you don't know those words. But the context as well as controlling a document will lock down the document to become a record. So hopefully we can kind of see the difference between what a record is and what a document is. Next, I want to look at classification. So ISO 15489 defines classification schemes as a systematic identification and arrangement of business activities or records into categories according to a logical structure. This might be a slightly cumbersome definition, but really what we're looking at is a way to organize our records, a filing structure, a file plan, folder naming. So that's what we're looking at here. And typically what we see as a best practice is what we call a functional classification approach, where we have a function at the top, and then we have this hierarchy of subfunction and activity. So the example I provided for you here is of finance, and I'll show you how we can use this in your electronic records management practices in your organization. But for now, we're just going with the concept of classification as a filing structure or a systematic arrangement of your records. Next, I am going to address retention schedules. So a central part of records management is making sure that records are kept for as long as they are needed, but no longer. So electronic records management systems can achieve this, as well as regular physical records management can achieve this using a retention schedule. So a formal definition is a set of instructions allocated to class or file records to determine the length of time for which they will be retained for business purposes, historical relevance, legal obligations, or archival value. So the example here I gave you is a screenshot of a retention schedule from the Government of Alberta's Administrative Records Disposition Authority. These are, I guess, policies that allow us to determine when something needs to be destroyed, after how long, or does it need to be, maybe it needs to be archived and not destroyed. I'll go into this a little further later in our session, but I just wanted to prime you on a retention schedule being the rules for how long we keep our records and what we do with them afterwards. Next, we have metadata. So often we hear metadata as data about data. It's often quoted not just because it is accurate, but because it's short and easy to remember. But essentially, we're talking about data that describes the context, content, or structure of the record. So there are a number of types. There's many different types of metadata. And it's by no means limited to basic objective metadata about a document, metadata that supports retrieval and discovery of it, as well as anything that might be related to your management processes. So some selected metadata I've included here for you is from Dublin Core, which is an international standard of metadata. And it's linked here for when you do get the slide presentation. But here, some examples of metadata is that you have a title, description, date, and language. And these are, so again, this would be the information that you collect or the data about the record or data that you have, that you're holding on to in the organization. Next, I am going to look at disposition. So disposition is defined as a range of processes associated with implementing records retention, destruction, or its transfer decisions, which are documented in disposition authorities or other instruments. And disposition authorities can mean a retention schedule. But basically, what we're saying is disposition and even destruction are part of the records management process, is part of the life cycle. And it can mean different ways of how you are disposing or dispositioning your records. It includes destruction, however you may see fit, shredding, the deletion of records. It could also include secured destruction or deletion. For example, putting them in locked bins or having a professional, I guess there's services that destroy records as a profession and give you a destruction notice to say that they have been legally destroyed. And then there's also the transfer to an archive, which is part of the disposition process. And lastly, the last term I want to introduce to you is vital records. So this is another records related concept that is quite important. It's a critical mission. It's often a critical record to an organization's mission or existence. Loss of the records may cause harm to the organization. And often these vital records need exceptional protection and possibly redundant backups or extra storage, even fireproof vaults. So something like this, an example of a vital record could be a contract, patents or intellectual property, birth certificates, blueprints, maps, specific customer records, or cultural artifacts. The idea here of vital records is that if they were to be destroyed, they could be irreplaceable. You may not be able to produce them again. So that's the idea here. So now in terms of terminology, how are we doing? Any questions? Do I need to clarify anything that I've mentioned already?
Olena, may I ask you to
Yeah.
maybe provide a few examples again, going back to the difference between a document and record?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I don't know, a draft minutes of the board meeting versus approved minutes as a possible
Yeah.
example, but I would like you to
Yeah,
expand a bit.
absolutely. Yeah. So a document could be something like that's more drafted, that is just a working copy, something that even trying to think, yeah, meeting minutes, drafts, something that is specific to like meeting notes or your own personal notes, that might be a document. But when you put it as a record, you want to be able to file it into a folder. Let's say a folder for visualization's sake. If you had a folder with all your financial record or all your financial documents all together, now that creates a record. So within that folder is your context, and it's controlled in the electronic records management world by who has access to it. Or in your home, if you have your records in a banker's box or a safe or under the carpet, wherever you're holding your records, you only have access to them. So that's the control, and the context is the container that they are in, or where you can find them. Does that help, Marina?
A little bit, yes. Thank you. I would also like to, I don't see any other questions, but I would like to offer a comment from the archivist perspective.
Yes.
When you were talking about disposition, I was thinking how important it is if there is a records management program in place, if there is a retention schedule, so that whatever records are kept for are kept for preservation, are transferred to archives. The archivist already knows that they are all important to be kept, other than trying to deal with multiple copies of minutes and things like that. So it is a very a complex approach. Really helps here. Thank you.
No, thank you for that addition. All right, we'll keep moving on. So now we're going to look at some electronic records management concepts. So in terms of record formats, we can have almost any form of a record. There can be electronic records that come from a large number of sources: messages, word processing documents, presentations, spreadsheets, diagrams, emails, databases, audio, video are just some examples. But then there's also the physical records that we also need to, that are equally important. So that we can look at as like the files that we have, any kind of microfilm or microfiche, any actual records, CDs, flash drives. So just to keep in mind that when we talk about records, we're looking at electronic and physical records. But again, our focus here today in our session is really to talk about these electronic records that may not necessarily be structured. So we're going to try to structure them in a way for your organization. Next, I also want to bring up the idea of records and non-records. So non-records here, you can also think about as the documents sometimes, but these concepts may need to get, we might need to get a little getting used to them as well. It is quite complex. And again, it can vary from organization to organization, as I said before. So with this understanding, a record could be outgoing letters, some emails, contracts, final documents, policy procedures, audit trails, meeting minutes, reports. And in terms of non-records, we may see press clippings, event invitations, some meeting arrangements, publications that are readily available. And these documents or records don't necessarily need to be filed, so they're considered a non-record. So this much is straightforward. But you'll see here there's some less clear information or documents. So like memos, internal emails, and drafts. For some organizations, these actually might be records. It really depends on the regulatory requirements as well as organizational policies. Now, the example I will give you is, let's go with educational curriculum development in the government. They keep all their drafts because they need to show evidence of the curriculum development process. So for them, for an education ministry, those drafts are actually going to be a record. That those drafts of this presentation, for example, not a record. So just to keep that in mind, that again, an organization can really define what is a record and what is a non-record. And there is gray area in all of this. Now, there are some characteristics of records that we should also keep in mind. So authenticity, that means an authentic record is one that is or what claims to be created or sent at a purported time. It's a very vague answer or very vague definition, but essentially we want to be able to show that it is authentic. And in the paper world, we'd say that you'd see like a signature or wet ink on a document. So in the electronic world, trying to show that a record is authentic can sometimes be a little tricky, but sometimes we'll have the approved status or a scanned document saying final version. There's different ways to make an electronic record authentic. We also want to make sure that records are reliable and trustworthy, and they're an accurate representation of what has happened. So reliable records are generally created at the time of a transaction or an activity. So we want to make sure that any kind of discussion is captured properly to be a reliable record. A record demonstrates integrity by its completeness and not having been altered. So again, if you have an approved version of a record, if it's been altered in any way, then it has lost its integrity. So then at that point, it's going to be a new record, which is another, we can talk about that more if you have questions. And finally, we want to make sure that records must be usable, meaning that it can be searched for, retrieved, reviewed over the course of time in your organization. So here we have a record's life cycle. This is a very simple one, but it comprises of 3 primary phases. So that's the creation or capture of records, the maintenance and use, and the retention and disposition. So now we're going to look at each of these in more detail in the next few slides. So the first phase is creation. In other words, records can be created or received, and the process of formally receiving records and placing them into a records control framework or a record structure is called capture and declaration. So the formal definitions of these 2 ideas can be a little bit more theoretical, but informally, you need to understand that capture is the process of getting records into a system and recording that they're existing in the system. This can include scanning records into an electronic repository, or even just keeping paper or physical records in filing cabinets. So here I've listed some questions for you to consider with your organization about creation and capture. So where do we create the records? Is it born digital? So again, are we creating records and printing them, or are we just holding on to electronic records and then filing them appropriately? Where do you save them? Is it available to everyone? And do we need to scan paper records? So Again, there's no right answer for these questions or any of the questions I'll be presenting you. It's just more to get you thinking about what needs to occur in this part of the life cycle. Once the records have been created and captured, they'll be presumably used within your organization for different activities. So often we want to classify it or put in some sort of filing structure. In terms of indexing, it can include making sure that they're named properly, or so they're able to be retrieved easily. We want to make sure sometimes there's access controls. So does everyone in your organization need access to financial documents? Something to ask your organization, and maybe you need to put some access controls around that. We can also talk about selecting and implementing the right storage area, and what tools are you using to make sure your records are readable and accessible today and tomorrow. And finally, there might be some auditing reporting involved in what your electronic records management life cycle, especially if you require it for evidentiary purposes. So again, some key questions to consider within your organization. How are you organizing your information? Can they be searched easily? Do the right people have access to it? Do you need to have access to the records offline? If you're using electronic or cloud-based solutions, you might not be able to see your records offline. So what happens then? And then how are you maintaining different versions throughout the use of the records? And finally, the retention and disposition and even destruction are acceptable phases in the information life cycle. And it's an accepted practice that documents or records are to be dispositioned at the end of the life cycle. The details for how they are retained or dispositioned should be spelled out in some sort of procedure or policy. And again, retention is the preservation of a document until its retention period expires. And we'll go through that in a bit. But once a record has met its retention and it is no longer needed, you have to consider what are you supposed to do with it now? Do you keep it forever? Do you destroy it? If you destroy it, do you need to do so in a secure way and ensure that it can't be replicated or can't be taped back together, for example? So this is just something to consider again with the retention life cycle, or records life cycle and retention and disposition phase. And
Olena,
finally,
there's a question.
oh yeah,
Sorry, I don't know if you want to take it now or maybe a bit later. It's up to you. So the question is, are emails considered records, and how can an organization clarify this?
Yes, emails can be considered records, yes. And if you can hold that thought on whether we can consider something a record or not, I have a tool for you coming up in the presentation here that will help you determine whether something is a record or not. So if we can kind of hold that thought and maybe revisit this question in a little bit. But yes, in short, emails can be records.
Thank you. I'll take a note. I'll make a note for that.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So in this slide here, I'm just going to go over some fundamental principles for records management. And again, especially for electronic records management. So first, records are created, received, and used in the conduct of organizational activities. Every organization and almost every function of an organization will create records. So we should strive for them to be created and maintained in an authentic, reliable, and usable manner. Records should always be accessible, protected, retained for as long as they need to be required, or as long as required, and then dispositioned at the end of their life cycle. So these are just some key fundamentals that I do want you to remind yourself of in your organization with electronic records management. So that's the concept portion of this session. Any questions about concepts at this point that I've highlighted here today?
We'll be going back to what record is and is not.
Yeah, no, it's going to come right up after this. Okay. Well, hopefully you can keep some questions boiling in your mind, and hopefully I'll be able to help you through this next with this next section here about supporting tools and resources. So here I have designed a records decision tree for you to help determine whether something is a record or not. So I am going to go through, so first we need to determine, does it provide evidence of an organizational activity or decision? Let's say yes. Then are you the creator or sender of this document? Could go yes or no. You might want to, oops, sorry, I just realized I duplicated something here. But basically we have to determine, is it evidence of an activity or a decision? Are you the sender or recipient of a record? And does it justify the decision or action? So with that logic, let's say the situation of an email. Let's use an example of Marina sending me an email that she that we're going to be booking this session. So that's the email. Confirmation that this electronic records management session is happening. So does it provide evidence of an activity or decision? I would say yes, Marina made a decision that we're doing this session. Am I the creator or sender of the record? I am not, if that's the case. If I'm the one receiving it, it's not a record for me. However, for Marina, it could be a record because she is the sender of that information. And then does it just explain or justify an action or decision? Yeah, we know what the next steps are. So in that case, for Marina, the record of sending me an email to put together this electronic records management session would be a record. So hopefully that helps with the email situation or the email scenario. Any questions, or did I confuse any of you?
This is very helpful. This is a nice
yeah,
graph.
Thank you. And before I send it out, I'll make sure I don't duplicate "Are you the creator or sender?" My apologies for that. But yes, you can understand the flow of it, and understanding that what your role is, and is it showing evidence of an activity or decision, and does it justify an action or decision? Are these the key questions that you need to be asking yourself?
So I'm thinking how often in archives we have records of, in correspondence, we have only the recipient part, right? Not the sender, and they're still often considered records exactly because they explain or justify a decision or action. So this is, I find it very helpful. Yeah, and Irena, did you have a comment or question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Olena. This has been very interesting. I just have one quick further question on emails, because I do find that sometimes there's a lot of discussion in emails, and there's a lot of people that are included in the string of emails. So ultimately, when a decision is made, so let's say I'm the source, it goes through quite a few reiterations, and then finally there is a decision. The email, if you keep the whole email string, sometimes it could be a little bit contentious in some areas. So I guess my question is, would I, as the original sender, after all the conversation, consider the record to be the full conversation, as you talked about? Sometimes you'll keep draft conversations as a record. Would I keep the whole email and place it somewhere where everybody can have access to it with the full string of conversation?
Yes, exactly what you're describing would be best practice. And sometimes that can be tricky, but often having that full picture is the context that is needed for for it to be a record. So keeping that entire chain, not necessarily just the decision or action, is quite helpful. Does that help?
Yes, yes, it does. And maybe I can ask one more question. Marina asked it, I think, earlier on, and she was talking about minutes. And I think we're all kind of overwhelmed sometimes with minutes. And I know that from our organization, we've started to slim down on the discussion that we're including in the minutes. So sometimes it just comes to whatever, a decision or an action item. But yet that loses some of the conversation. So I am wondering, in terms of a record, whether you have, or whether I just need to look up what the definition of good minutes are, whether it includes this conversation in this draft, you know, going to the final filed minutes.
Yeah, I know. And unfortunately, all I can say right now is it really depends. It's going to be up to the organization to define what actually should be a record. So whether discussion should be captured as a record or not, if it's about planning a potluck, maybe that's not needed. If it's about discussing finances, maybe that is required. So it's really up to the organization to define that as well.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you.
Olena, we have a comment in the chat. I will read it and see if you want to reply to it.
Sure.
Many Ukrainian archives or institutions retain collections created somehow historically. We are neither creators nor original recipients, but are rather focused on the retention side of something that came before us from a third party.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so in the electronic records world, what that situation we often call it is that you now have orphaned records, that the owner is no longer there, but you still need to maintain the records throughout its life cycle. And you now have become the new owner or controller of those records. So it is tricky, especially within a historical organization and a cultural organization as well, because that collection can grow quite a bit. I see Jen is unmuted. Is there any additions to that?
Well, I just wanted to say that it is still helpful to think of it, looking at this graph that you offered, because very often we in the archives, we receive documents, let's say, of 3 prominent individuals, and each of them, aside from their own correspondence, as an example, would have UCC newsletters, right? So in this case, if you apply this thinking to whether they were senders or recipients, in that case, neither. And it helps you decide, okay, this has nothing to do with Manoli Lupul, let's say, and we're not going to keep it in his personal collection or form.
Exactly.
Just a comment. I hope it helps someone.
No, I think I appreciate that insight too, especially from your perspective. Any other questions, comments, feedback about this?
There is a question. Are photos without text considered records?
Without text, yeah, they could still be considered records. And I think that's up for your, that's again, going to be something that your organization would need to define. Is it evidence of a summer camp happening? Is it evidence of a festival happening? It could be. It's also for archival purposes and historical organizational knowledge. It also does inform and create some context around some of the information that may be there. So it helps add to the bigger picture. So it can be a record, but again, it really depends on the organization.
I think that's all the questions for now.
Excellent.
Sorry,
right.
I just have to interject.
Yeah,
from an archival perspective, though, a photo without any information doesn't provide any context. So if an organization is creating a photo and adding it to their records for future for future, because memories don't last forever either. You need to make sure that you have the basic information, you know, who took the photo, the date, who's in the photo, and what the event is, minimally, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is a great time also to highlight too of the Archives 101 session that did occur, I believe, a few months ago. And there was quite a number of great resources and tips there on archiving as well. So that was also done by the UCC Archives Committee. So a little shout out there to the team here, because I think if you do have questions about the archiving pieces, hopefully those that presentation can help you. And then again, we're here to also help you along the way if you have questions. All right. I'm going to move on to some naming conventions. So there's benefits for having some consistent file naming, and it makes it easier to browse your electronic records. So some elements of a naming convention that you might want to consider are the date. And sometimes we like to see it organized by year, month, day. And I'll show you an example of that. We might talk about the file type. You may have a short description in the name, a project name even, a version number might be something that you want to use in a naming convention, as well as the status, whether it's draft, final, or working copy, or approved. So I'm going to show you some examples of this that hopefully you can integrate into your organization. So I gave you 3 different scenarios here. So the first one here, I want to organize my meeting materials by the meeting date. So for me to do organize meeting materials by the date, I'm going to, my naming convention that I created for my imaginary organization was to have the year, month, day, and then the file type. So this will organize in a electronic record system quite nicely, because it will group the agenda and minutes together, because the dates will line up and go in numerical order there. I also added a column of what would happen if we did the file type first, and then followed by the date. So this would group all the agendas together and the attachments together and all the minutes together. And if your organization wants to file records that way, that's perfectly fine. But for my scenario that I was working through, I wanted to organize that information by the meeting date. So that's just one example of how you can name your files to be more effective or efficient. Now, let's say you have an emergency plan. For me, my scenarios, I want to organize it by version number. So this is something I want to highlight to you about having the file name and then a version number. You'll see in the 2 columns, I've included the exact same naming convention, but the order is actually going to be different depending on the number I put there. So when we name our files, it actually goes in text form. It organizes information in a text format, not a number format. So you'll see that I've used 2 digits, a 01, 02, 03 in the first column, and the versions get all organized nicely. But if I do, for version 1, instead of saying 01, if I just put 1, then it will reorganize in a different way. And it'll have all the files that have the 0 first go to the top, and then it'll go after the 1, and so on. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're doing naming conventions, that with all the greatest intents, you also want to make sure that you're organizing, that the information is going to be organized in a way that helps you understand the activities that have occurred. And if you're going to add in a version number, I highly recommend you use the double digits, just so it can be organized more nicely, I guess you could say. And then again, let's say we have another scenario of event posters, and I want to organize this by event. So here I just have my elements that I'm using for the naming convention are an event and the date. So here I have Congress, Independence Day, and webinar, and I have the date highlighted right after that. And I just realized I have a mistake in here, but that's okay. With the Congress dates in the first column, the two titles or the two Congress would actually be sorted a little differently because 2016 is before 2019. So you'd actually see that file first. But again, you'd see it in alphabetical order as the file text. This is in contrast to having the date first and then having the event. Again, you can, if your organization wishes to have event posters organized by date, that's completely fine. But it does have different meanings and different use cases for understanding how the records are being managed here. So how do we feel about naming conventions for electronic files?
Olena, I just wanted to add consistency over all of this slide, and I see there's a tiny word at the bottom. Maybe it cut off something.
Yeah, I think so too. But you're right. It's nice that that word is just peeking out there for us. But yes, consistency is so key here. If you want to be able to have electronic records management done right, consistency of your naming conventions is so crucial.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter what rule you decide upon as long as you stick to it.
Exactly. So often I'd even recommend that within your organization, you actually create a naming file or naming convention document, and just that's your set of rules for how you want to name your files.
Thank you.
No worries. Anything else? Okay. I'll move on to filing structures. So a filing system is critical to staying organized also. It helps you save a ton of time, and often, and this way you'd often don't have to go hunting for your records. And so here I've created a structure or hierarchy for you, and this can be implemented digitally or even in the physical world. You can do some sort of twist on this. But again, here I'm using that classification scheme or classification structure that I've mentioned previously, where you have a function. The functions would be the teal color here, your sub-functions would be the red, and then different activities being in the blue. But the idea here is that you might have an organization, and then within that organization, you have some board governance, you have financial document. Maybe you do a lot of grants. You want to have grants on their own and not under financial. You might have some human resources, human resource records if you have anyone employed with you, operations and programs, for example. So this filing structure, we can actually translate it into an electronic format for you. So the example I grabbed for you here is the grants function. So as you can see in this first box here, let's see if this works. So in this first box here, this is essentially all the functions that we saw within our organization that I highlighted in the structure before. Now, if I click on grants in our electronic system, it would take us to our sub-functions, which are like these red items here. So we just, within that hierarchy, you're creating a folder structure. And again, it'll take you down to the year. If you click on correspondence, you'd get down to the year folder. And then within that year, you might see all the files. So this is just an easy way to create, it's an easy way to create, again, consistency with your organization by having a hierarchy file structure like this outlined for your organization. And that can ensure that people are able to create files or save files easily. And they're able to, if they're not sure where to put something, you can actually go back to your filing structure and say, oh, I know that something is going to, like under the grants folder, there's going to be a correspondence, and I can file my records there by year. So it could be quite helpful to have this filing structure available for your organization. So any questions about filing structure? Okay, all good. Yeah, so again, this was just an example I pulled together for a generic organization, but again, consistency in making decisions that is right, making decisions that are right for your organization is so important here. Last, or one of the last topics I want to address here is records retention. So we talked quite a bit about that here. So I gave you a table that you can work with your organization on if you don't know how long you're supposed to be keeping certain records. So the rule or formula I have here is that if a retention, whatever your retention name is, records have met the retention trigger, then we will do some sort of action after a specific duration. So the example here I have is for plans, goals, and objectives. And I'm saying that they will be destroyed after 10 years when the records have been superseded or obsolete. So that means like if you have a strategic plan for your organization and next year you come out with a new one, that means this old one that you have from this year will now be obsolete and you have to keep it for 10 years and then it can actually be destroyed. So that's a general idea here of trying to understand how long do you actually need to keep your records, or can you just hit delete on anything? And again, certain records might need to actually be kept, or they might have like legal implications if they are not kept. So I'm also going to provide you with some other examples. So for example, board meeting minutes and board policies. This might be archival value for an organization. This might be something that wants to be historically kept. It may not necessarily be accepted by an archive, but it's vital to the historical memory or corporate organizational knowledge of an organization. So here we have meeting minutes, and we can say maybe after the calendar year, they need to be kept for 5 years, and then they can be boxed up and put for long-term keeping. Similar with board policies, it'd be like the superseded or obsolete trigger, or that's when you can destroy it. Or sorry, that's when you can box it up and put it away for safekeeping. And this teal table here are financial documents. So typically we look at the Canadian Revenue Agency for some direction on that, on how long you want to keep some fiscal records. And often we look at the fiscal year end as being the trigger. So yes, here you might want to keep your annual audit files forever. It might be a permanent indefinite retention for your organization, as it could be extremely valuable. But your bank statements, invoices, and cash receipts, those could, in theory, be destroyed after a fiscal year end and 7 years, like 7 years after that. So again, these are not rules. These are just examples. Your organization would need to go and work through these tables together to determine what records do you keep and for how long, and what do you do after with them. So how does that sound to everyone? Did I confuse you all?
This is very helpful, and I think these concrete examples are very helpful.
Yes, I'm glad they're helpful. And again, it can be tricky about what needs to happen and how long do you keep it? Should they be destroyed? Do we keep them forever? But I would suggest when you when you look at your records and think of it in your terms of organization or even your personal records, first classify your records and understand, what do you have? I have my board meetings, I have my policies, I have these invoices. Let's capture those first. Then you can say, okay, when do I not need them anymore? And then how important are they? Should they be archived? Should they not? And again, depending on your regulatory compliance, if your organization has board bylaws that say for every 4 years, you have to keep those records, often the organization should have some sort of policy on record keeping. If not, make sure they do. But this is just a place to get you started. Now, I kind of alluded to this here, where often your classification scheme can translate to your records retention. So the goal here is that you don't want to have two different tools or different pieces of information available to you. However you organize your information in a filing structure, you should be able to apply those same retention principles to that content. So the example here I have is board meetings. We know that they can be archived 5 years after the calendar year has been completed. So what that means is under meeting minutes in this folder here, if I broke it down to every single calendar year as a subfolder in an electronic records management setting or environment, I can say, okay, if I had any files in the 2014 folder, I can now move these records because we've already hit that 5-year period. I can move these records to an archive environment within my electronic records system. And that just might be a separate area from your working area. Similarly, board policies, that means anything in this board policy area in your folder structure, in your electronic records environment, you can actually archive everything all in one, as long as it's all captured here correctly with the right naming conventions that can help you understand whether something has been superseded or obsolete, because that's what's important here under this heading. So I'm hoping we can kind of see how they work together in tandem and how this can be extremely valuable for your organization by having these two tools available to you, this classification scheme, as well as the retention records table. Any questions here about how they work together?
We're good.
All right, so far so good. Okay. I am slowly coming to an end here, but within the slide deck that you'll be receiving, I have provided you with a ton of additional resources that are available to you, just to kind of get you started as well. If you feel that the examples I provided in this presentation aren't really fitting what you need, or you want to see what others are doing, I've given you a couple of examples of records decision trees for you as well. I've given you some examples for links to file naming conventions. I've also given you some retention and disposition instruments from different organizations as well. So again, how these organizations have already determined how long certain records need to be kept. You can use it as inspiration for your own organization, and you can also adopt that to create your own classification hierarchy. So these are all going to be available to you for your own research and browsing. And then I also included some links to some other resources that are available to you, just in case you are interested or not sure of where you can get started. So I included some Government of Canada policies and standards, and as well as some not-for-profit organization resources. So there's a workbook for you about protecting personal information. There's an introduction to records management for nonprofits, as well as a guide to right record keeping from Charity Village, which is an online resource for nonprofit organizations. So just know that there are a ton of resources out there. So you're definitely not alone in doing anything with electronic records management. So we're nearing the end here. So for a session recap, we went over record keeping drivers. So we've already identified that compliance, effectiveness, efficiency, and continuity are the drivers of an electronic records management system. In terms of record keeping terminology, you've learned today records, document, and what the difference are between the two, classification, retention schedule, metadata, disposition, and vital records. In terms of concepts, we've talked about electronic versus physical, a record versus non-record. We've talked about different characteristics, so authenticity, reliability, integrity, usability. We've talked about a record's life cycle. We've talked about different electronic records management principles, including access, protection, retention, and disposition. And finally, I've left you with some tools and resources. So we've talked about a records decision tree, file naming conventions, a filing structure, records retention, and then some more resources for you. So with that being said, I want to say thank you. If you have further questions, I'm here to answer them. And if you want help in the future, the UCC, Ukrainian Canadian Congress Archives Committee, is here to help you as well.
Thank you, Olena. And to all participants, you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions. We're a cozy group.
Well, this has been very, very helpful. I will thank you. Thank you, Olena. This has been very, very helpful. And it gives, I know for me and my organization, a lot of food for thought on organizing everything first and deciding that structure, because we're doing, Sapotroshka. But thank you very much. This is very helpful, a very good guide.
No problem. I'm glad you found it helpful.
Thank you, Olena. Thank you for this great session. I learned a lot personally, and my biggest takeaway is that records management is the art of throwing things away, and I think it is true. Thank you for that so much.
No problem.
Just a reminder to everyone that the slides will be sent to everyone, to all the participants. The recording of the video will be posted on the Kulfukwa Center channel, and we will share it through UCC channels and through our own as well. If you have additional questions that come to you later, feel free to email us. It's archives@ucc.ca or suchnetwork@ualberta.ca. Yes, and I also wanted to remind and make an announcement. A reminder is that our next workshop that we are offering is the digital preservation workshop, where we will be talking a lot about records integrity and authenticity that Olena mentioned today. It's a workshop that the Kulfukwa Center is hosting, but it's done by the Canadian Conservation Institute together with the Canadian Heritage Information Network. It's only, there's a limit of 25 participants. We are almost booked, but there are still a few places left. And the next November workshop that we will be offering as the committee is Archives Volunteer Program, Principles, Design, and Workflow. And it will be delivered by one of our committee members, Andriy Chernevich, who is the archivist at the Gold Museum at Archives in Lethbridge. We're still confirming the date. It will be either November 6th or 13th. All right, well, thank you very much again for your participation. Thank you, Olena. And we will see you again. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thank you.